2 races. That's all it took for the entire grid to turn against Mercedes. Back-to-back 1-2 finishes. A gap of up to half a second in key sectors. 0 reliability issues. And now, multiple teams are pushing the FIA to step in. Because this doesn't look like normal dominance. It looks like something no one else can replicate. Same regulations. Same engines across teams. Completely different results. So the question every team is now asking is simple. What does Mercedes know that nobody else does? Stay until the end, because one hidden detail behind these protests could change the entire championship. Subscribe now, because this story is only getting more serious. At first, nobody called it a protest. Because in Formula 1, nothing starts that way. It starts with questions. Small ones. Quiet ones. Why are they faster here? Why don't they lose time at the end of the straight? Why does their performance never drop? That's how it began after Australia. Engineers going through data. Sector by sector. Lap by lap. And something didn't match. Mercedes wasn't just quick. They were consistently pulling away, in the exact same places. Power zones. Long straights. Energy deployment phases. And the gap wasn't random. It was repeatable. And that's what made people uncomfortable. Because repeatable performance means control. And control means understanding. But at that stage, teams stayed calm. Because one race is not enough. You don't react to one race. You observe. You wait. You gather more data. And then China happened. And suddenly, everything accelerated. Because now it wasn't one data point. It was two. 2 completely different circuits. 2 completely different race profiles. Same outcome. Mercedes ahead. Clear. Untouchable. And this is where the first real alarms went off. Because now, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. And patterns in Formula 1 trigger action. But here's where things take a more serious turn. Because the complaints didn't come from one team. They came from multiple directions. Ferrari started asking questions. Honda engineers began looking deeper. Audi, quietly analyzing. And even teams running Mercedes engines started to feel the pressure. Because they were seeing something even more confusing. The same power unit? Behaving differently depending on who used it. That's not supposed to happen. Not under strict homologation rules. Not in a system designed for equality. And yet, that's exactly what the data suggested. And this is where the conversation changes. From curiosity to concern. Because now, it's no longer about being beaten. It's about not understanding why you're being beaten. And that's the most dangerous place for any team. Because you can't fix what you don't understand. You can't catch what you can't explain. And right now, Mercedes is becoming exactly that. Unexplainable. But here's the key moment. The moment everything shifts. Because once multiple teams reach the same conclusion, independently, they stop asking questions internally. They take it outside. To the FIA. Not as an accusation. Not as a direct protest. But as a request. A request to look closer. To verify. To measure differently. Because something doesn't feel right. And in Formula 1, when enough teams say that at the same time, it becomes impossible to ignore. But this is still just the beginning. Because what they are actually asking the FIA to investigate is far more specific than most people realize. And once you understand that detail, you start to see why the situation is escalating so fast. And this is where the protests stop being vague and become very specific. Because teams are no longer asking general questions. They're pointing at one exact area. One detail that could explain everything. How the engine is measured. Not how it's built. Not how it's installed. How it's tested. Because right now, the FIA checks power units under controlled conditions. Static environment. Stable temperatures. Predictable parameters. Everything designed to ensure fairness. But Formula 1 cars don't live in that world. They live on track. At full speed. At extreme temperatures. Under constant stress. And that difference might be everything. Because what several teams now believe is that Mercedes has found a way to operate differently, only when the engine is in real race conditions. Not during inspection. Not during standard checks. Only when it actually matters. And if that's true, then the FIA might be measuring the wrong thing. That's the concern. That's the protest. Because imagine this. An engine that behaves perfectly within limits when tested. But once it reaches race temperature, once materials expand, once everything is pushed to the edge, it unlocks something extra. A small gain. But in Formula 1, small is massive. We're talking about a few tenths. The kind of gap we've already seen between Mercedes and the rest. And suddenly, the dominance starts to make sense. Because it's not just power. It's when that power appears. How long it lasts. How consistently it can be used. Lap after lap. Stint after stint. No drop-off. No limitation. And that's exactly what Mercedes has shown in both races. But here's where the tension rises even more. Because this idea, this possibility, is almost impossible to prove. You can't easily replicate full race conditions in a controlled test. You can't perfectly measure what happens inside an engine at peak load, in real time. And that's the problem. Because teams are not saying Mercedes is illegal. They're saying, the current system might not be catching everything. And that forces the FIA into a very difficult position. Because now, they have two choices. Do nothing. Trust the current tests. Assume everything is within the rules. Or, change the way engines are monitored. Introduce new measurements, new sensors, new procedures. Essentially, rewrite how compliance is verified. And that's not a small decision. Because if they change it, they are admitting that something might have been missed. And if they don't, they risk allowing a potential advantage to grow unchecked. And this is why the protests are so powerful. Because they're not emotional. They're technical. They're structured. They're coming from multiple teams at the same time. And most importantly, they all point in the same direction. A gray area. A window in the regulations. One that Mercedes may have understood before anyone else. And here's the part that changes everything. Because if this window is real, then closing it won't just affect Mercedes. It will reshape the entire grid. Performance gaps will shift. Competitive order will change. And teams that are behind today could suddenly be much closer. Or even ahead. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because we are not just watching a dominant team. We are watching a potential turning point. One decision, from the FIA, could define the entire season. Maybe even the entire regulation era. And the most important part? That decision hasn't been made yet. And this is where the situation becomes almost impossible to control. Because once the FIA starts looking into something like this, they don't just check one team. They open everything. Every parameter. Every measurement. Every assumption the sport has been working under. And that creates a ripple effect. Because suddenly, it's not just about Mercedes anymore. It's about the entire grid. Because if the way engines are being measured is incomplete, then how many teams are actually operating in that same gray area? How many have found smaller versions of the same idea? How many are just less effective at it? That's the risk. Because the moment you question the system, you question everyone inside it. But here's what makes this even more intense. Timing. Because this is happening at the very start of a new regulation era. 2026. New rules. New power balance. New opportunities. And if one team has already figured out a critical advantage, then every race that passes makes that advantage stronger. More data. More refinement. More control. And for the others, more pressure. More frustration. More desperation to catch up. And that's exactly why teams didn't wait. They didn't give it 5 races. They didn't give it time to normalize. They acted immediately. Because they've seen this before. A small advantage at the beginning turns into dominance for years. And by the time you react, it's already too late. But here's where things get even more delicate. Because the FIA cannot move too fast. They can't just change rules overnight. They need evidence. They need justification. They need to be absolutely certain before they intervene. Because if they act without proof, they risk damaging the credibility of the sport. And if they don't act, they risk damaging the competition itself. That's the balance. And right now, they're right in the middle of it. But inside the paddock, something else is happening. Something quieter, but just as important. Teams are starting to divide. Not publicly, but strategically. Some are pushing hard for changes. Ferrari, Honda. Others are more cautious. Because they know any change could affect them too. And then there's Mercedes. Calm, controlled, confident. Because from their perspective, they've done nothing wrong. They've simply understood the rules better. Executed better. Prepared better. And in Formula One, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. So now, we arrive at the real turning point. Not on track. Not in a race. But in a decision room. Because what happens next will define everything. If the FIA introduces new tests, new ways to measure real conditions, new limits on how engines behave under heat and stress, then Mercedes could lose part of that advantage overnight. And the grid could compress instantly. But if they don't, if everything stays as it is, then what we've seen in Australia and China is just the beginning. Not the peak. The beginning. And that's the part that should worry everyone. Because dominance in Formula One is not built in one race. It's built in understanding. And right now, there is one team that seems to understand this era better than anyone else. So the real question is no longer, why are teams protesting? It's this: is Formula One about to step in? Or are we watching the start of a season where the ending has already been written? And this is where everything finally connects. Because behind the protests, behind the FIA pressure, behind Mercedes' dominance, there is one reality that no one can ignore anymore. This isn't just about speed. It's about control. Total control. Control over performance. Control over reliability. Control over understanding something the rest of the grid is still trying to decode. Because look at what we've seen. Mercedes wins both races. Flawless execution. No issues. No limitations. At the exact same time, customer teams struggle. Failures. Uncertainty. Inconsistent performance. And that contrast is too sharp to ignore. Too precise to be coincidence. And this is the moment where the paddock starts to accept something uncomfortable. Mercedes didn't just build a fast engine. They built the most complete system. Engine, software, energy management, integration with the car. Everything working together as one, while everyone else is still trying to connect the pieces. And that's the real gap. Not horsepower, not aerodynamics, understanding. Because in this new era, the teams that understand the system control the outcome. And the teams that don't are always reacting, always one step behind. And sometimes completely exposed. Like McLaren in China. Like others quietly struggling in the background. But here's the part that changes the entire story. Because if this advantage comes from understanding, then it cannot be removed easily. You can't ban knowledge. You can't regulate experience. You can't erase what a team has already learned. And that's why the FIA's decision might not be enough. Even if they step in. Even if they change measurements. Even if they close every possible gray area. Mercedes may still be ahead. Because they solved the system first. And that is something no regulation can undo overnight. Which brings us to the real conclusion. The one nobody wanted to face this early in the season. This might not be a fight. Not yet. Because before teams can fight Mercedes, they first have to understand Mercedes. And right now, they don't. So the protests, the pressure, the investigation, all of it leads to one final question. Not whether Mercedes is legal. Not whether the FIA will act. But something much more decisive. By the time the rest of the grid figures this out, will it already be too late?